We don't agree on very much today. We are very divided, but I think all of us are united in this: rich, poor, male, female, whatever political orientation you are, we all hate to wait. Isn't that true? We sit in front of our microwaves, drumming our fingers because the food is taking too long. We sit in traffic. Some of us honk our horns. Some of us just do that in our minds because we're frustrated at the person in front of us. We go into a high-rise building and you press the button and you get frustrated because the elevator takes too long. In fact, do you know that there's actually research done on this? People who design high-rise buildings have research to know, they have to know how many elevators to put in a building so that people don't have to wait too long, right? So they've done studies where they rig up cameras to watch people, and then they intentionally delay the elevator varying amounts of time, and then watch how people respond to then determine how long it takes before people get impatient and frustrated for the elevator to come. So do you know how long it is between pushing the button before people get frustrated? What the patience level is? I've heard 10 seconds, 5 seconds. You guys are really impatient. It's actually 15 seconds. 15 seconds before people start to get ticked off. And in fact, if it goes beyond 40 seconds, then people start to get visibly upset and start pacing around and shouting. You might also notice they put mirrors up in a lot of places because they can get a few more seconds that way. Because we're so vain, we want to look at ourselves in the mirror and we get a little bit more calm so we can wait a little bit longer. Anyway, we hate to wait. And this goes deeper than just like being in a hurry because we feel behind, but it's just we hate to wait for stuff. We want things now. And of course, we carry that mindset into our spiritual life, right? We pray and we expect an answer. We want an answer. And so we might ask for something, and then if things don't change within a week or two, or maybe even if it goes a few months, we get frustrated and maybe even tempted to give up, and we get maybe even disillusioned. It's hard for 21st century American people to take the long view, and yet that's pretty much exactly what we are called to do as Christians. Often in our lives, God pushes us. God challenges us. It's like the very thing God does because he's wanting to teach us something that can only happen in the process of delay. We learn to trust God's timing. So that's what this season of Advent is all about. It's a season of waiting. It's the time that we look ahead we prepare ourselves for Christ's coming. On this side of Christ's entrance into the world, we prepare ourselves and we think about Christ's second coming, but it's all about waiting. And it's a season that reminds us then that God is at work, even if and when we don't see that, even when that timetable that God has is different than ours. And so what that means, at any given time, many of us, maybe most of us, are dealing with secret battles, right? Things that we're struggling with, we're discouraged about or frustrated about, maybe we're praying about, and we're not seeing anything happen. Or maybe it's not a secret battle, but maybe we have like a secret hope of something. There are things we want in our lives. And maybe like hopes and dreams for ourselves, things that we're seeking and we're asking God for, and we don't have them yet. We don't see them yet, so we're waiting. At some point, I think all of us can identify with the writer of Psalms who cried out, said, Lord, how long? How long before you answer? How long before you do something? How long am I going to have to wait? The passage we just read is our text this morning. That's what it's all about. It's all about what happens when people wait and struggle and don't see a response. So the message is titled Living with Hope, right? But you might even, the not so nice way of saying it is living without hope, right? What happens when we've given up hope? What happens when you have these unfulfilled longings, when you're praying for something or asking or seeking something and it's not happening, when God seems silent? All right, so the Gospel of Luke opens with this account, the account of Zechariah and his wife Elizabeth. Now, Zechariah comes onto the scene at a pretty dark time in Israel's history. It's a dark time politically and religiously. I mean, the nation of Israel, as we all know, if you've been around in church, you've heard people talk about this, right? At this time, Israel was under the thumb of the Roman Empire. And they had a lot of frustration. In fact, during Jesus' life, there were a number of political uprisings because people were so unhappy. Luke tells us that Herod was king at the time, and we know from history that Herod was king from about 37 BC until right up to the time of Christ. And the other thing that historians tell us is that Herod pretty much used whatever influence he had to pull the Jews away from their worship of God. He is the one who introduced the worship of Roman gods into Jewish life. He built a number of temples and shrines to different gods. He introduced Roman games to Jewish culture. He encouraged the corruption of priesthood by allowing people to pay bribes to him to get elevated to official statuses as priests. So it was a dark time. It's a dark time spiritually because also, along with this thing with Herod, there is quietness, or it seems like God is absent. I think that's probably what it was like. I mean, for years, throughout Old Testament history, no matter what was going on, there was always somebody, there was always someone, maybe even more than one prophet, someone who God was speaking through to instruct the people about how life should go, that God would give his revealed will to the people through some prophet. And there was nobody. In fact, it had not just been a generation or two since God had spoken to the Israelite people. It had been 400 years. The very end of the Old Testament is the book of Malachi, and that was written, we think, around 400 BC. That was the last word. Since then, silence. Nothing. So that's the setting of this account. So let's look at the people involved. The two leading players in this account are Zechariah and Elizabeth. And I guess in this particular instance, when Zechariah goes into the temple, there's also an angel. But let's talk about Zechariah and Elizabeth for just a sec. A couple things that we learn about them. And there's a place for notes if you want to write stuff down. First, we learn that Zechariah is a priest. And we're going to say more about that in just a minute. We also learn that Zechariah and his wife are good people. They're God-honoring people. They're God-serving people. Now, it's one thing for us to claim that, to sort of position ourselves as Christians. You maybe heard of the guy who thought pretty highly of himself as a Christian. He was a leader in his church, pretty proud of his piety. And one day he visited the Sunday school class where some kids were, and he was asked to say a few words to the Sunday school class. And he stood up before them and he said, "Why do you think people call me a Christian?" From the back of the room, a little kid says, "Maybe it's because they don't know you." Tough crowd, right? Well, that wasn't the case for Zechariah and Elizabeth. They were the real deal. Their lives may not have been perfect, but it says that Zechariah was righteous in God's eyes. that he was careful to follow all the commands of God. So this is important to know. This is not, some drifter spiritually. This is a faith-filled, godly man. But the third thing we learn is that they're old, they're advanced in years, and that's important, especially because of number 4. The thing we learn is that they are childless. They don't have any kids. Verse 7 tells us Elizabeth was barren. Now, in any era in history, from our perspective today, we know how painful that is, or if we've experienced it, or maybe even if we haven't experienced, we can imagine what it's like for couples who struggle with infertility. It's a big challenge. It's a growing challenge in our world. We feel for people who really want to have kids and can't have kids. And also keep this in mind, however hard and painful it might be for people today, back then it was way worse. Because if people did not have kids, that was their social security. That was their safety net. See, the government didn't take care of people when they got old. Their children did. And so kids were then not only the pride and joy of parents, they were also social security for parents. And so they were seen as, super important for people, but also like spiritually, there was a theology, there was this understanding that children were a blessing from God. They were from God. They were gifts from God. And then the flip side would be that the lack of children was like a curse from God. That there might be something wrong with you if you were childless. So, and finally, the other thing is, just so you know, in that culture, if a woman was not able to have children, that was legal grounds for divorce from her husband. The husband could divorce her and find another woman, hopefully, to have a child with her, right? So that was apparently relatively common for that to happen. Well, with Zechariah and Elizabeth, that's not what happened. They stayed together. They kept serving God. They kept praying and not getting the prayer answered. So now you get the picture, right? So it is this guy, an elderly guy, well, I don't know, older guy. And for years, he and his wife have been living with this personal pain. They've been praying for children years and years. Becomes evident it's not going to happen. And not only that, we're going to see this, it pretty much seems like they've given up hope. They've been waiting and asking. Nothing seems to be happening. All right, so one day, Zechariah has a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. Like, literally, it's an opportunity that very, very few people get. He is selected to be the priest to go into the temple on the high holy day. Now, he's going to burn incense in this temple, and that is a sign, or that's like a symbol of all the prayers of the people going up to heaven. And just so you know, historians tell us that about this time, there were about 20,000 priests in Israel. And so, I don't know if you caught this in the text, it says that it was the time of Zechariah to be a priest. So what happened was, maybe the analogy would be like being in the National Guard, right? Where you have a whole bunch of people who have this role, and they're only called up at certain times. So that would be the case. There's all these priests, and at certain times you get called up to serve as a priest. And then of all those people who get called up at a certain time to be the priest, what they would do when they had a holy day like this, they would cast lots together and determine which of the priests who were serving at that particular time got the honor of going into the temple. So Zechariah is the guy who has the chance to do this. Again, something that probably most priests would never have this honor or this experience in their whole life. And Zechariah gets it now as he's an old man. He's called up, he gets this honor, goes into the temple, and then the story picks up from there, right? So when he's in the temple, an angel appears. If you have your Bible in front of you, this is verse 11. An angel appears, and the angel says, Zechariah, your prayers have been answered. You and Elizabeth are going to have a son. Not only that, but your son is going to be special. He's going to be the one to prepare the way for the Messiah. And in fact, there's something that you might miss if you just sort of read it casually. But if you look at verse 11, the angel says this about the child, that he will go on before the Lord in the spirit and power of Elijah to turn the hearts of fathers to their children and disobedient to the wisdom of the righteous, to make ready a people prepared for the Lord. So remember what I'd said, that at this time it had been 400 years since there had been a word from God, 400 years since God had spoken through a prophet. And so, in fact, let's look at that. The very end of the Old Testament is Malachi chapter 4. I'm going to put a verse up on the screen. You'll see Malachi chapter 4, verses 5 and 6. God says this, See, I will send the prophet Elijah to you before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. He will turn the hearts of the parents to their children and the hearts of the children to their parents, or else I will come and strike the land with total destruction. So in other words, here God is picking up what had been said at the end of the Old Testament, and this child of Zechariah was not going to be an ordinary child. This child would actually be the link between God's promise in the Old Testament, and also a warning in the Old Testament, and then the fulfillment of that in the New Testament. His coming would be a sign that God would not strike the land with total destruction, but that he was going to send a Messiah, the day of the Lord. And this child, Zechariah's son, was going to be the one to announce all of this. So going back to the text in Luke then, if you look at the text, verse 16, it says he would be responsible, this son of theirs was going to be responsible for bringing many people of Israel back to the Lord. Now, awesome, right? What is Zechariah's response to all of this? Basically, he's like, really? How can this be? I'm an old man. My wife, it's kind of like Moses or Abraham in the Old Testament. How could this be? I'm an old man. My wife is old. And then Gabriel speaks, the angel speaks, and he doesn't sound terribly happy about his response. He's a little bothered by what Zechariah says. Basically, the angel says, okay, you don't believe this? You want a sign? I'll give you a sign. You're not going to be able to talk until the baby is born. So that's the thing, that Zechariah from this point on was going to be mute, unable to speak until the baby is born. Now, again, I want to emphasize this. The fact of the matter is, Zechariah had given up. And he and Elizabeth, after all the prayers and hoping for years, nothing had changed. You can imagine that during all these years of their lives, they'd probably got their hopes up in the past. Maybe they felt like God had spoken to them and was going to give them a child, and then it never happened. You go through a bunch of times like that of getting your hopes up and getting them dashed, and then you just stop hoping. Again, maybe some of us can identify with this experience in other dimensions of our lives. So time went by, the childbearing years come and go, and they're like, it's not going to happen. Now, of course, we know from our perspective, we can look back on this and see, well, obviously, God was at work. God was working out the plan of salvation, and that required waiting. The time had to be just right for John to come into the world, John the Baptist, who was going to be John the Baptist, and then so that the time would be right then for Jesus, the Messiah, to come into the world. And so God blessed them with the child. He answered their prayer and involved them in the plan of salvation for the world. That's Amazing. Well, maybe you're thinking, okay, I've heard this before. That's cool. Great for Zachariah and Elizabeth. It's a great story, good for them. But what does this have to do with my life? What does this have to do with my situation and what I am struggling with? Well, the God that we worship is the same God of Zachariah and Elizabeth, and he works in our lives the same way that he did with them. And the Bible teaches that God is the same yesterday, today, and forever. And so there's some principles here that I think maybe can give us some comfort. Two reminders. I'm going to call these the two takeaways. So first, remember that God is at work even when I don't see it, even when you don't see it. Even when I don't understand what God is doing in the world and in my life, even though I can't see God's activity in my life, in the world, even when it seems like the prayers that I'm praying are just stopping at the ceiling, God hears and God is at work even when we don't see it. So these days we are in the midst of, I know some of you are into anime or other kinds of cartoon or I can't think of the right word, but when there are drawings on a film. What's that? Animation. Thank you. There's the word. Now, these days we're in the midst of a changeover between when things were hand drawn and now things are computer generated. And in fact, just film in general, there are movie theaters that are replacing the old film projectors with now video projectors. So it's old school now, but just can you picture a film like, and the films that they show in theaters are these massive, massive things. If you look at a film, it's actually a reel of thousands and thousands of pictures. And each individual picture, each individual frame has the scene, the characters, but in that frame you like see who's there, but you don't really understand what's going on. You can't see it, or you can't work it out what's going on by just seeing a frame or two. It's like when the frames are projected and you see them all, you see the sequence, then the movie starts to make sense, right? And that's the issue that we have in our lives. We're living our lives a segment at a time. And in this particular segment, this frame that we're in, at any given moment, we have this experience or that experience, but we don't see a pattern a lot of times. We can't see the pattern. And certainly we can't see into the future, but God can. And God's creating this pattern. And sometimes part of this pattern is that God delays. Or sometimes maybe even God simply says no to our specific requests and brings something else into our lives. And when that happens, those delays or the no's, from our limited perspective, we can't understand why the things are turning out the way that they are. And we can get pretty bent out of shape. We can get very discouraged. We can get very distraught. We can even become resentful. Why, God, are you doing this? Why are you not doing this? Where are you? Well, can you trust? Can you trust that, like so often happens, when you look back on things, they start to make sense? Can you trust that what's going on right now is also one of those things? That God is working in your life, working in the world, in ways, again, that we struggle to see or understand, but that will bring things together at the right time. Could you trust that God is working out all things together for good, as it says in Romans 8:28? And sometimes we just take that in faith. We just have to trust that that's happening, even though we don't see it. We just keep, like Zechariah, we just keep showing up. We just keep serving God and leave the results into God's hands. So Oswald Chambers has a devotional book, My Utmost for His Highest. I think some of you have used that book. Here's one of the things he says in his book. He says, faith is not a pathetic sentiment, but rather a robust, vigorous confidence built on the fact that God is holy love. You cannot see Him just now. You cannot understand what He is doing, but you know Him. Shipwreck occurs when there is not that mental poise which comes from being established on the eternal truth that God is holy love. That God is at work in my life, in my circumstances, even when I don't see it. All right, well, the second takeaway, though, goes even a little bit further. Not only is it true that God is at work even when I can't see it, it's also true that God is at work even when I don't believe it. Even when my faith is weak, even when I'm confused, even when I'm disillusioned. Now, I realize this might sound a little different, maybe unusual from things you've heard in other places in churches. We're often taught about the importance of faith, that we're told we got to have faith, we got to trust God. That's true, but sometimes we take it so far that it's like we make God's blessings conditional on our faith. So look again at Zechariah's faith and his response to the angel. The angel says, here's what's going to happen. You're going to have a son. God's going to work through him in a powerful way. Wouldn't it have been nice if Zechariah had said, got it. That is exactly what I've been hoping and praying for. Thank you. This makes a lot of sense to me. No, he doesn't do that at all. He's like, no, how could this be? I'm an old man. Like, again, he'd given up. So take note of this. This is very significant. God's decision to answer those prayers was not based on the strength of Zechariah's faith. When the angel lectures him that he's going to be speechless because of his persistent skepticism while the angel's there, remember that God gave him this gift in spite of the fact that he was struggling, that he had given up. See, some people have this idea about faith that it makes God's activity conditional on our faith. It locates the source of power in me, right? In you. If you believe it enough, then it's going to happen. And if it doesn't happen, it's your fault because you didn't believe enough. If we really believe something, then it's going to happen. And of course, Jesus does talk about the importance of faith. But at the same time, you have Jesus talking about if you pray in faith that this mountain will be removed, it'll happen. Okay, that's true. Also, it's true that God blesses those who are weak and struggle. So it happens that we have people running around these days trying to make themselves believe something, trying to trick their minds and feeling guilty and bad. But look, faith is a response. It's a response to what we've seen and experienced. And the great news then, this is great news because it means that God can take a little kernel of faith that you have, that I have, and work with that and make it grow. So we can say like the man said to Jesus, Lord, I sort of believe, help my unbelief. Just act on the faith that you do have. Just keep trusting in what God has already made clear to you. If you're at a time of waiting, maybe at a time of doubting, just think about the fact that God may very well be at work here in ways that you don't see or understand. And so then act on whatever is in front of you in faith, with whatever faith you do have. That's what Zechariah did. He kept going, he kept serving God. He struggled here, and yet God used him in powerful ways. God was at work in Zechariah and Elizabeth's life, even though they didn't see it, even though Zechariah didn't believe it, had given up hope. And I don't know about you, but that gives me hope. Because there are times in my life where I need to trust that God is at work and I can't see it. And there are times I have to rely on the fact that God is at work in spite of my weak faith. So part of the process of spiritual growth for each one of us is learning how to wait, learning how to trust God. Then at some point we can look back and be able to see how God was at work. And we can say, like Elizabeth said later on, God was at work. Glory to God.